It's now my pleasure to introduce to you the speaker this evening, Francis Sullivan. He's the Chief Executive of the newly formed Truth, Justice and Healing Council. Before commencing with the Council, he was Secretary-General of the Australian Medical Association, which represents the interests of more than 27,000 doctors. And during his time at the AMA, Francis oversaw political and policy strategy and worked to ensure that the peak doctors body remains one of the most listened to lobby groups in Australian federal politics. Francis in his career has been very committed to equity and justice. He's a passionate public advocate for the health and welfare sector and has developed a high profile over the years in public debate. Many of you perhaps first would have seen the work of Francis when he was the Chief Executive Officer of Catholic Health Australia. He was 14 years in that role and he spoke on behalf of 73 private and public hospitals. He has a master's degree in theology from Loyola University in Chicago and a bachelor's degree in politics from the Curtin University in Western Australia. In 2008, the Australian Catholic University awarded him an honorary doctorate for his work in public health advocacy. Francis lives among us here in Canberra with his wife Susan, who's here tonight, and their 3 children. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Francis Sullivan.
Good evening everyone, and thank you very much. And it's great to know that I'm a draw card away from the British Lions, because he said that I could speak through to about 8:15. But I just had one look at Mark Metherell and realised I'll be finishing a lot earlier than that. But it's also great just to see people that I've known in many walks of life for me here in Canberra. So thank you very much for coming. It's really cold and I won't go on forever. But this is an important topic. So not long after starting the Truth, Justice and Healing Council, which, as you know, has been established by the bishops and the religious leaders in order to fully engage with the Royal Commission, I was rung up by an advocate for victims groups. And they said, "You've been saying on the radio and the TV that you want people to tell their story. You're saying that you want people to listen to their stories. Are you dinkum?" "Yes." "Well, if we gave you an invitation, would you come down and listen to our stories?" And I said, "Yes." And so down I went to Melbourne early this year, to a room filled with people roughly my age. And from about 9:30 in the morning through till after lunch, I sat and listened as one person after another told their story. And at the end, the person organising the day said to me, "Well, is there something you would like to say?" And for those of you who do know me, I'm not short of a word. But I said, I don't know what to say. As a matter of fact, I'm nervous about saying anything, because to say anything would be inadequate. And just to my right, there was a very well-dressed fellow who I think works in the media, and he had told his story. And he said, "I've been watching you all day, and I've been listening to you on the radio over the weeks before. I think you're sincere." He said, "But don't you dare let us down again." Now, that experience haunts me, because not only did I realise that when I was with those people, I had no idea and no experience in my life that could relate to what had happened to them. But I was really shocked at their sense of abandonment after so long. So I'm going to talk a little bit beyond that. So what would it mean to not be let down again? First and foremost, people who have been abused and damaged want to be believed, their experience understood, and their word accepted. Secondly, they don't want to be isolated and ostracised. So how do we go down the path of not letting people down? So from my perspective, the first thing is ensuring that victims and survivors are allowed to tell their stories, that they have the opportunity to stand up and be heard. They need to be given the time to tell that story, no matter how long it takes, for them to find the words and the courage to speak them. The second thing is the importance of the disposition of the church towards people who have been abused and damaged. People have an expectation about what our church stands for and what it believes in. That actions should speak louder than words. Apologies only mean something when people feel them and believe that they are sincerely delivered. It is crucial that the church communicates and humbly projects a spirit of compassion and contrition that enables an atmosphere and a dynamic for healing and reconciliation. This forms the basis on which people who are damaged can have their experience validated and addressed. This means people need to feel comfortable coming towards the church. Victims need to be believed. They have to be able to take their concerns to the church and know that they are not going to be judged or treated harshly, no matter how confronting it might be for the church. Even if they've been through a process that has led to some sort of settlement, in many cases, their pain and anguish is still unresolved. Most likely, in some cases, it can never be entirely resolved. For many, nothing can restore the innocence of those who have had it taken away. But as a church, we need to walk with the survivors who want to be heard, particularly during this time of the Royal Commission. We need to put in place better systems, processes, redress, and contrition that says, in one way or another, you are damaged, we believe you, we are sorry, we want to help you heal, and we are working to try to make sure that what you went through never happens again. And when we talk about damage that has been done to people, it's important to understand what that means. According to the advocacy group CLAN, many victims and survivors live with feelings of fear, guilt and shame. Low self-esteem, self-hatred and depression are all commonplace. Many survivors struggle with building trust, having been betrayed as children by the very people they depended on: priests, brothers, teachers, family members. People who should have protected and cared for them, but ultimately betrayed them and damaged them. Many grow up to have relationships that are dysfunctional and damaged, that are abusive and dangerous. Many suffer alcohol and drug addiction. Survivors often report reliving the abuse, flashbacks that can be triggered by smells, events, and actions. Many suffer frustration and shame and are unable to build healthy sexual relationships as a result of the abuse they suffered as children. All this and more is often part of what the victims and survivors of child sexual abuse have to live with. So what is the backstory that has brought us to where we are today? Wherever in the world it has arisen, the Church's history of clerical sexual abuse and the way it has been handled has in the main not been good. For many years, we have seen and heard a litany of allegations levelled against some priests, brothers, Catholic lay workers and others within the Catholic Church. Priests and members of religious orders have been jailed. More have died without facing a court or being brought to justice. And at the same time, there continues to be thousands of victims prepared to stand up and tell their stories. Stories of being dismissed, threatened, ignored, and treated as guilty by past church authorities. Now, before I go any further, I want to make one thing very clear. The approach the Church takes to dealing with clerical sexual abuse now is dramatically different to its approach prior to 1996 and as it evolved over the course of a decade or so prior to that. Many things have changed for the better. This needs to be acknowledged, and I will come to this shortly. And that's a long way from saying there are not many more things that need to change, because there are. But the fact is, our history has not been good. As it stands, there are no reliable national figures available yet on the incidence and handling of child sex abuse within the Catholic Church in Australia. To understand the full extent, we need the answers to these questions. How many people have come forward to the Church with allegations of sexual assault? How many priests, brothers, nuns, and lay workers were involved? How many were reported to the police? How often did the police investigate? How many charges were laid? How many and who went to jail? These questions are being addressed. As part of our work, we are preparing materials for the start of the Royal Commission's public hearings and are collecting information that will go some way to answering these and other questions. It will be important that other organisations do similar work in the community and so that the Commission is able to get a clear picture of the extent of child sexual abuse across all institutions. Now, there are many views on why the scourge of sexual abuse has been a significant part of the Catholic Church's history in the 20th century. In 2004, a major report into clerical sexual abuse in the United States Catholic Church was commissioned by the US bishops, and it was publicly released. The John Jay College report, as it is known, identified a number of factors contributing to the sexual abuse scandal in the US. Amongst those were these: the failure by the church hierarchy to grasp the seriousness of the problem, an overemphasis on the need by the hierarchy to avoid scandal, the use of unqualified treatment centres, a misguided willingness to forgive, and insufficient accountabilities. At the same time, there was a profound lack of understanding within church leadership about what to do with offending clergy, and a shocking ignorance of the often serious lifetime effects of abuse on children and young people. This lack of understanding of the psychology of pedophilia, as it is now understood, and its impact on children wasn't, of course, just confined to the Catholic Church. It was widespread across many, many institutions at the time, including government institutions. The present understanding is that pedophilia is a condition that can't be cured or treated. The Church took advice from professionals who gave that advice in the context of the knowledge available at the time. Prior to the mid-1990s, there was a profound misunderstanding of the nature, causes and treatment of pedophilia. It would appear the responses of church authorities were often based on the idea that successful treatment of the offender was possible, as was the psychological and psychiatric understanding for much of that time. And while this goes to why there has been abuse, the other key issue is why the Church failed to respond at the time to the claims of victims. The list of failings is extensive, and it reads the same in the United States, in Europe and in Ireland. The failure to report abuse to the police, the failure to remove offending priests, the practice of moving offenders onto other places, misjudgments around the nature and response to pedophilia, failure to impose penalties, and over-reliance on legal advice, and protecting the reputation of the Church, often ahead of the needs of the victims. During his evidence to the Victorian Parliamentary Inquiry, Cardinal Pell said that when he became Archbishop of Melbourne in 1996, there were no records of sexual abuse allegations kept by his predecessor, Archbishop Frank Little. He also gave evidence that in the Victorian Diocese of Ballarat, the then Bishop Mulcairns destroyed files. At the time, Ballarat was home to some of the Australian Church's worst abusers. While there has been very little good news to come out of the Victorian Parliamentary Inquiry, which finalised its public hearings earlier this month, one sign of hope that justice is possible is that the Church leadership in Melbourne and Sydney have again acknowledged very publicly the mismanagement and the cover-ups of the past. And this can only be a good thing. It is important to acknowledge the Church is making a concerted effort to build a responsive and inclusive reconciliation process for victims of clerical sex abuse. With the Melbourne response and towards healing processes, the Catholic Church put in place pastoral processes to allow victims, if they wish, to engage with the Church outside the legal process. Both these approaches were groundbreaking and well ahead of their time. Their intent is to meet victims and survivors primarily in a pastoral relationship as opposed to an adversarial legal approach. The work of the Church's National Committee for Professional Standards has overhauled the professional standards within the Church, and violations of boundaries issues in the workplace and parishes. The significance of these changes has been independently recognised by former Justice Anthony Whitlam in his inquiry into the Father F matter that spanned the management processes in the Armidale and Parramatta dioceses relating to the sexual abuse perpetrated by Father F. In short, Justice Whitlam indicated that sadly, had the current procedures for reporting child abuse laid down by the Church's Towards Healing protocols been in place in the 1980s, then the tragedies perpetrated by Father F could have been averted. And interestingly, Father Frank Brennan, writing in Eureka Street earlier this year, said, the then Bishop of Armidale, Kennedy, was not the only one out of his depth in the saga. Practitioners in law and psychology were also found wanting. This stark reality is very hard for the families of Father F's victims. It is damning of the Church administration at the time. It also indicates that the Church has made significant progress in the professional handling of allegations, reporting to authorities and managing clerical movements. And while there has been progress, there is still a very real perception in the broader community and in a significant part of the Catholic Church itself that little has changed. The days after the appearance of Church leaders at the Victorian inquiry, there were two markedly different editorials in the mainstream media. The first, which appeared in The Australian on May 28th, titled "Cardinal's Evidence Puts Abuse Crisis in Perspective," provides a potted history of the past and the measures that have been put in place by the Catholic Church to address the problem. It concludes by saying, quote, "The Royal Commission must recommend effective safeguards, but it must not allow itself to denigrate into a kangaroo court. He, Cardinal Pell, and Archbishop Hart are in the forefront of dealing with the abuse and mismanagement that has undermined the Church's credibility. They are part of the solution, not the problem." On the same day, the Fairfax Press ran an editorial that was particularly harsh on the Church's response over the years. Quote, "From the outset, the Catholic Church should have dealt openly, honestly, generously, and promptly with complaints of sexual abuse. Yet even now, it struggles to get its words out clearly. Its apology does not penetrate even the first layer of hurt, and that only undermines whatever good it is trying to do." End the quote. What is clear is that there are strongly polarised views within the community about how the Church has responded. It is also clear that formal apologies from the Church have not been received in the spirit they have been given. The current Church leadership in Australia polarises people's view of the church and what it has done. Some may say that this is the result of a media agenda designed to undermine church authority. This may have some validity, but my personal view is that this may be too simplistic. The way the church and other institutions have historically dealt with child sexual abuse is an important news story that no self-respecting news outlet would ignore. And while there are many that say much of the reporting is biased, interestingly, this isn't how at least the bulk of mass goers see it. The 2011 Church Life Survey of some 2,500 regular mass attendees across 217 parishes found that 63% of attendees either had no view or believe the media has been fair in its coverage of sexual offences by priests and religious. It would be a mistake for the Catholic Church to believe that the Royal Commission exists just because of a media campaign that is out of proportion with the concern of the community. That said, the coverage of sexual abuse and the intense focus on the Catholic Church has had a huge impact on the people in the pews, the local parish priests and the workers in our Catholic health, education and welfare organisations. Recently there was a very interesting gathering in a Sydney parish a couple of months ago. It was organised by the parish leadership group with the direct involvement of the local priest. Around 25 parishioners met to talk about how the issues of child sexual assault had impacted on them and their faith. It was part of an overarching parish program that also included special prayers for the victims. Words like angry, saddened, shocked were commonplace. Many could not understand what clerical sexual abuse was even about, having never been in direct contact with it. There was a real sense at the meeting of the need for clear and strong leadership that puts victims first and demonstrates real compassion, concern, sympathy, understanding and contrition. While this was only a small group of regular churchgoers, it is clear that as a church we need to get better, clearer information to the Catholic community if they are going to understand what the Church has done since the introduction of Towards Healing and the Melbourne response. It is not the role of the media to explain the fundamental changes in approach that were heralded by these two programs. This is our job. We've got a long way to go to improve these processes and compliances with them, collecting better data, opening ourselves to working more closely with the authorities, making sure all we do in this area is best current practice and as open and as transparent as possible, while of course protecting the privacy of victims and survivors. The fact is, there will always be supporters of the Church, just as there will always be people who turn their back, whether out of disillusionment or an erosion of the place of institutions, particularly religious institutions in modern society. There is and must be a middle ground and a genuine attempt to restore trust in the Church. The question must be asked: if the Church has responded as well as it claims, why is there still so much hostility, almost 20 years after it put in place the Melbourne response and Towards Healing? Are the attacks on what has been set up, or are the attacks on something else? After 2 decades of hard work and the efforts of hundreds of people of exceptionally good will and talent, people have spent years dedicated to addressing the issues of clerical sex abuse. What is it that the Church has to say or do for the community, victims in particular, to restore trust? So I have a couple of thoughts on that. We as a church need to be talking about how people who have been damaged might find their way back to the church. We have to examine a culture which has allowed secrecy, silence, intimidation, legalism, obfuscation to let sexual abuse happen. We have to look at clericalism and power. These issues go to the heart of the fact that the Catholic Church's role as a lived expression of the gospel has been diminished in the eyes of Catholics and non-Catholics alike. So here we are, a few months into the private hearings of the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse, and just 3 months away from the start of public hearings. As has been well reported, the commissioners will investigate where systems have failed to protect children, and they will make recommendations on how to improve laws, policies and practices to prevent and better respond to child sexual abuse in institutions. The commissioners can look at any private, public or non-government organisation that is or was involved with children, including government agencies, schools, sporting clubs, orphanages, foster care and religious organisations. As you know, the Honourable Justice Peter McClellan, AM, has been appointed as the chair of the Commission. He's been appointed for 3 years and will release an interim report by no later than 30 June next year. Given its size and the apparent extent of the abuse in so many quarters, governmental and other, there is little doubt the Catholic Church will be a significant focus of the Commission. Catholic Church leaders have been emphatic in their support of the Commission. There are 2 peak bodies in the Church: the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference, which represents Australia's 33 dioceses, and Catholic Religious Australia, which represents some 180 congregations of brothers, nuns, priests and other religious. And they've thrown their weight behind the Royal Commission. In a joint statement with the leader of CRA, Sister Annette Cunliffe, Archbishop Hart said, "I am confident that the Royal Commission will enable an examination of the issues associated with child sexual abuse nationally and the identification of measures for better preventing and responding to child abuse in all those institutions that work with children." So the Catholic Church leadership has fully embraced the Royal Commission and has acknowledged the failings of the past. A quick sample: Cardinal Pell, quote, "I will continue my efforts to offer practical help and support respectfully and compassionately to those who are suffering because of these crimes." Archbishop Coleridge, recently from here, now in Brisbane, quote, "We can never forget that the deepest hurt has been suffered by those abused and their families. As a church, we commit ourselves to do all that we can, not only to bring the truth to light, but also to bring justice and healing to those who have been suffered." Bishop Fisher from Parramatta, quote, "I know I speak for our entire Catholic community when I say that our hearts go out to the victims of child sexual abuse, the little ones whom Christ most loves, and to their families. We are ashamed of past failures and determined to do better." Bishop Ingham in Wollongong, "The protection of children is of prime importance, not the protection of any organisation. Victims and their families must receive respect, justice and compassion." And just to round it off, finally again, Archbishop Hart, "Sexual abuse in any form and any attempt to conceal it is a grave evil and is totally unacceptable. As Christ's Church, we must face up to the truth of these revelations and not attempt to disguise, diminish, or avoid in any way the actions of priests and religious who have betrayed their sacred trust. In the start of the Royal Commission, the Church made a statement of lifting the confidentiality clauses that were previously in place to remove the barriers so that anyone who wished could go forward to the Royal Commission and tell their story. This is just one action that demonstrates the Church's intention to fully cooperate with the Commission. It is incumbent on the Church to be open and honest about this history and to match words with actions. This is the only way that the community can trust that the Church will fully embrace the Royal Commission, fairly and justly. In order to provide the Commission with unqualified cooperation, the Catholic leadership committed to establish the Truth, Justice and Healing Council to deal with the Royal Commission on the basis of a single, by which I mean one church, approach. It's appointed the Honorary Barry O'Keefe, AM QC, a former Commissioner of the New South Wales Independent Commission Against Corruption and a former Chief Judge of the Commercial Division of the Supreme Court of New South Wales, as its chair, together with 10 other eminently qualified and committed people and 3 clerics and religious as council members. 5 of the 10 are women. Their expertise ranges across child sex abuse, mental health, suicide, public policy and law, and it reflects the very clear desire of the Church to ensure a fully professional response to the Commission. 4 of the councillors have either been victims of abuse themselves or have family members who have been abused. The Council will act as a collective advisory group to the Church leadership through a supervisory group made up of bishops and congregational leaders. We are presently developing the shape of submissions and the reviews of Towards Healing and the Melbourne response in light of what's considered best practice these days. We are looking at a range of other issues: working with children checks, reporting abuse to police, the possible liability of bishops and other church leaders, and questions as to limitations on compensation. That's the policy side. The other arm, and the bulk of the Council's day-to-day activities at the moment, is collecting and collating documents for the Royal Commission in response to notices to produce documents that have been issued by the Commission. To date, more than 24 notices have been issued to bishops, congregation leaders, Catholic education officers and other church entities. As at the end of May, some 150,000 documents have been uploaded to our IT system. Tens of thousands of documents remain to be identified and uploaded. Once uploaded, the documents need to be reviewed before being submitted to the Royal Commission. About 24,000 have already been reviewed and provided to the Commission. This is time-consuming and intense work. It's also expensive. It brings together everything the Commission is after: every file, every policy, every incident, that report that touches on child sexual abuse. When complete, the documentation will provide a comprehensive picture of the Catholic Church's response to incidences of child sex abuse within the institutions over time from about 1960 to date. For us to be able to gather this material, all the religious congregations and all the dioceses have had to formally authorise us to act for them, which they are currently doing. We will not be trying to defend the indefensible. We will be open, we will be transparent, and we will cooperate. We will not countenancing any practices that in the past have generated so much anger and pain amongst victims. and that may have undermined the moral authority of the Church. For victims to hear the truth, this needs to be part of how all institutions approach the Royal Commission. Anything less will be another slap in the face to those innocents across Australia who have suffered. So where do we think the Commission might head, and what sort of changes can we expect to see in the Church's approach to dealing with sexual abuse? We need to understand that words are just words. Even when Church leaders give heartfelt apologies, many people remain damaged. The process of healing is not kick-started merely by words. Rather, it commences with a mutual spirit to connect with each other, to journey the difficult part of reconciliation together. As I have said, actions speak louder than words. The challenge for us as a church is to continually send genuine, positive signals to the people who have been damaged. That we believe their stories, that we respect the fact that they are justifiably angry and disillusioned with the Church, that we genuinely want them to be living lives of dignity and purpose, not merely existing bedevilled by pain and isolation. But we must also put actions behind these words. Action is imperative if victims and the broader community are to accept the Church will continue to build on what it has already put in place. There must be no doubt in the mind of Church authorities and leaders that every measure is taken to ensure only suitable people work with children within the Church. We should even go beyond the bare statutory requirements and put in place the most stringent working with children checks available. We need to be able to identify when a child might be at risk. Teachers, priests, religious community leaders need to be able to pick up on the signals. They need to be trained to recognise and respond to a child who is showing signs of abuse. We need to build processes and practices that help victims heal, that enable them, if they wish, to return to the Church, that enable them to live lives in the best way possible. This process must include a fair and just compensation. We need to build a process that can determine if a person is fit to continue working with children when a complainant has not gone to the police, or the complaint, for whatever reason, has not gone to the court. Justice is a two-way street, so those accused must also be afforded natural justice. While there must be natural justice for people accused, in the appropriate cases, allegations must be dealt with by the Church, even if they have been dismissed by the civil authorities. Importantly, any reforms the Royal Commission recommends must be effective across all of Australia. State governments must do their part in supporting the Commission and making whatever changes are necessary to ensure the nation is in lockstep when it comes to stronger, more effective child protection laws. I believe the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse is a crucial exercise for our future as a church in Australia. People who have fallen prey to offenders have the right to tell their stories and to expect justice. The Australian community has been kept in the dark for too long. We all need to hear how our church and others, including other churches, institutions and state and federal governments, handled or mishandled child sex abuse cases. This is a dark period in our church's history, and only when the truth comes out can a sustainable healing begin. Our embrace of the Royal Commission must be and will require a frank and open approach. We need to be prepared to face the inadequacies of the past, the times when decision makers did not exercise judgments that accorded with the standards of today. Judgments that were all too often inappropriate, even by the standards of their times. The way we approach the Royal Commission could well determine the very shape of the Catholic Church in Australia in the future. This approach cannot be about a muscular church, a defiant church, a church dragged reluctantly to the Commission, such that we are left with little more than a rump of faithful when the dust settles some 5 years from now. The spiritual disposition of the Gospels and the teachings of Jesus must shape how we go about this important and defining work. In conclusion, I would like to say, I know many well-intentioned people have grappled with doing the right thing and being there for victims, often to fall short in the eyes of those who have been damaged. Maybe in the commercial world, some will shrug their shoulders and say, sorry, this is as good as it gets. But for the Church, we have to go the extra mile. Ours must be, how good can it get? Thanks very much.